In the years 2007 to 11, a series of crimes that shocked the public took place on the territory of the Republic of Moldova. Despite the fact that the victims were people of different ages and genders, all the crimes had a clear signature of a maniac, and some even shared a horrifying common detail. The criminal chose young couples in love as his victims. Since the first crime, the investigation has identified almost 800 suspects in the case. 850 searches were conducted, and one suspect, who later turned out to be innocent, was convicted and spent more than 5 years in prison. The press dubbed the criminal the Durlești Maniac after the suburb of Chisinau where most of the crimes took place. More than 10 years later, this once high-profile case still remains unsolved. He found his first victims, or so it was initially thought, in September 2010 by a lake stretching along the Chisinau-Yeloveny highway. 31-year-old Valery Kruitar and his 19-year-old lover Mariana Jimbe drove to the lake shore in Valery's car to spend some time alone together. A deserted place, nighttime, perfect conditions for any crime. Even if the victim starts screaming, no one will hear her, and there's nowhere to expect help from if something happens. A car and 2 bodies next to it were discovered by random passers-by. The man's body was lying face down, and Mariana's naked body was lying a few meters away from her lover's body. Unfortunately, due to YouTube's censorship, I can't show some documentary materials, so I leave them in the Telegram channel Strashnoti. Go over, subscribe and watch. The link is under the video. As the results of the examination showed, both Valeria and Mariana were shot with a hunting rifle. Initially, no one suspected the work of a maniac. The investigation considered the case as an isolated incident, suggesting either jealousy, Valerie was married, or robbery as the motive, which seemed more likely since the audio equipment disappeared from the car. The law sets strict deadlines for the investigation of each individual crime. Exceeding these deadlines or failing to solve a crime, especially a serious one, always negatively affects the performance indicators not only of the specific investigator but also of the entire chain of their supervisors. And so all the allotted deadlines passed, but in the case of Mariana and Valery there wasn't the slightest lead, let alone a suspect. In fact, it had every chance of turning into another cold case. That's what an unsolved case is called in investigative jargon. But in the spring, a new crime occurred. The same Chisinau-Yeloveny highway, but instead of the lake shore, it was the St. Andrei Monastery, located 80 meters away from it. On the morning of March 31, 2011, a police patrol noticed a car near the monastery. In the car's cabin lay the lifeless body of 15-year-old Olga with a gunshot wound to the head. Opening the trunk, the police discovered another body, that of 19-year-old Ilya. Both the girl and the boy had been shot with a hunting rifle, and Igor was shot twice. Judging by everything, the criminal first dealt with Ilya, after which he moved his body into the trunk of the BMW. The body didn't fit. And then, in order to fit the corpse more compactly, the maniac broke both of the dead young man's knee joints. Initially, the investigation presumed Ilya's victimhood was not coincidental. After eliminating him, the criminal intended to force the defenseless Olga into sexual contact and then kill her as well. However, the examination disproved this version. Olga had not had any sexual contact, neither before her death nor ever. The deceased was a virgin. As in the case with Valeria and Mariana, audio equipment disappeared from the car. In addition, that evening, according to his parents, Ilya took a wallet with money and documents with him. It was not found during the body search. If the first crime went almost unnoticed by the general public, then the tragic death of 2 young people shook Chisinau and its suburbs. The young man and the girl studied in the suburban village of Durlești. Kind and responsive Ilya and Olga were good students, and they had many friends. The couple loved each other and dreamed of getting married. On that fateful evening, they just wanted to be alone together. By mutual decision of their parents, the young man and woman were buried in the same grave as bride and groom. Friends created a page in memory of Ilya and Olga in social networks with their shared photo, and soon the wall was filled with hundreds of condolences and memories. The public outcry was so great and the similarity to the previous case was so obvious that the prosecutor's office had to acknowledge it. It is possible that there is a maniac operating in the suburbs of Chisinau hunting for couples in love. The two criminal cases were combined into one proceeding, and just a month later, the criminal reminded everyone of himself by attacking another couple in love. Fortunately, the victims chosen by the maniac managed to avoid death. The crime scene was the same as in the first case, the lake near the Chisinau-Yeloveny highway. On May 1, 2011, a police officer, 25-year-old Igor Kazaku, came to the lake to spend time with his girlfriend, 23-year-old Ekaterina. It was already getting dark, but the couple in love just couldn't bring themselves to part ways. Sitting with the windows open, the young couple was enjoying the warm spring evening when suddenly a bright flashlight blinded Igor, and a moment later he felt the barrel of a gun against his temple. Igor, being an athletic young man, suddenly opened the car door and with a blow managed to throw the attacker off balance. While the criminal was coming to his senses, Igor jumped out of the car. Fearing for Katya's life, he shouted to her, "Run to the village," and then rushed at the criminal himself. Their strength turned out to be almost equal. Unable to take the weapon from the attacker, Igor also started to run away. Shots rang out behind him and his leg was seared by sharp pain twice. The young man fell, but he didn't lose his composure. He pulled out his pneumatic pistol and returned fire. Faced with unexpected resistance, the criminal chose to flee. It was dark and Igor couldn't see where the murderer ran. For a moment it seemed to him that in the darkness he heard the sound of a receding moped or motorcycle, but it could have been someone just driving down the road. Igor called the police and medics and he was taken to the Chisinau Emergency Hospital where the pellets were removed from his leg. The man spent more than a month in the hospital. During the interrogation, Igor said the attacker was of average to above average height, had a solid, physically strong build and wore camouflage but couldn't clearly describe their appearance. As for Yekaterina, after the attack she was slightly shaken but unharmed. Because of her fright, the girl at first couldn't remember any distinguishing features of the criminal. Later, she said that the attacker was a large man with a scar on his face. Whether she actually saw the scar or just thought she did in the darkness is unknown. The examination determined that the criminal fired from exactly the same type of hunting rifle as in the cases of the previous two couples' attacks. Two crimes completely similar could, albeit with some stretch, simply be described as a coincidence. But starting from the third incident, all doubts about the appearance of a maniac disappeared for the investigators. However, it soon became clear that the number of victims attributed to the maniac could be much higher than initially thought. After searching through the investigators' safes, the prosecutor's office brought to light a suspended case about the killing of a man in 2009. He was found dead in his own car, which was parked on the territory of Vinogradnik with 4 gunshot wounds to the head. He was shot with a hunting rifle. Another incident, which was later also attributed to the Dolezhsky maniac's attacks, ended well for its participant. In that same year, 2009, an unknown person tried to break into a car with a rifle while its owner was inside. The frightened man jumped out of the car and ran away, trying to save his life. The criminal stole the car stereo and fled. The investigation later concluded that the car owner survived because the incident took place not in a deserted area but in a parking lot near a house, that is, in a busy neighborhood. The criminal didn't risk shooting in a place where he could easily be heard. In these two earlier crimes, the weapon and the method matched, but there was a clear discrepancy in the choice of target. To urgently create a psychological profile of the criminal, expert psychologists were brought in to assist the investigation. From the explanations of the forensic psychologist, for a person prone to maniacal crimes, the desire to cause death is as much an addiction as dependence on alcohol or illegal substances. When such a person takes a victim's life for the first time, it triggers a powerful release of adrenaline into the bloodstream. A state arises that is similar to a drug-induced high. And just like an alcoholic or a drug addict deprived of a dose, a maniac who hasn't experienced this high for a long time begins to suffer from withdrawal. A strong psychological urge to repeat the episode appears. The desire to feel intense emotions again becomes stronger and stronger, and soon the criminal can't think about anything else. His range of motivation narrows, and his whole life becomes subordinated to a single desire, to find the next victim. At some point, he loses control of the situation and grabs any suitable opportunity. It's difficult to say why the Dorlensky maniac chose couples in love as his victims in 2010 and 2011. However, it's obvious that earlier, suitable targets for him were also lonely people. The main thing was that the victim was defenseless and there were no witnesses around. The psychologist's conclusions and the maniac's appearance in the service record. The new crimes, of course, did not reassure either the investigators or the local residents. All the more so because a new frightening episode had just occurred. On August 18, 2011, the body of a 35-year-old woman was discovered in the stairwell of a 12-story building in the city of Chisinau. According to the expert's conclusion, the cause of death was a shot to the abdomen from a hunting rifle. According to the residents, the shot was heard at night, after which the tenants on the first floor saw a large-built man with a mask on his face running out of the stairwell. Since the criminal shot the victim not in the head but in the abdomen and the killing did not take place in a deserted location, the investigation concluded that the nature of the crime did not fit the pattern of the Dorlovsky maniac. However, the locals were not ready to believe these explanations so easily. Fear settled in Chisinau and its suburbs. Men were afraid to go outside in the evenings even to take out the trash, and women were afraid to let their husbands go to work for the night shift. People demanded that the dangerous criminal be found immediately before there were more victims. The investigation into the Dorlesht maniac case took place during an extremely tense period in Moldovan history. Mass anti-government rallies, called the Twitter Revolution in the Western press, had just taken place. As a result of the revolution, a temporary coalition government was formed twice, and early parliamentary elections were held twice. As a result, in just 2 years, the country's top officials changed at least 4 times, including the Prosecutor General, the Minister of Internal Affairs, the Minister of Justice, and the Chairman of the Appellate and Supreme Courts. The Prosecutor's Office and the entire Ministry of Internal Affairs system saw frequent changes in middle-level leadership following the top officials. Each newly appointed chief considered it his duty to assure the frightened citizens that the Dorlensky maniac would soon be caught and put in prison. But what drove such promises was not only the desire to catch the dangerous criminal as soon as possible. Lower-level leaders were pressured by higher-ups one after another, and demands were coming down from above to solve the Dorle case immediately by any means necessary. Ill-conceived orders with unrealistic deadlines led to a real frenzy of arrests and searches throughout Chisinau and its suburbs. The arrest of yet another suspect was announced with great pomp on Moldovan television, but then, quietly and without any fanfare, the innocent person would be released in Osvoiasi. Desperate parents of Ilya and Olga, in a last hope to find the criminal, wrote to the Russian reality show Psychics Investigate, which was at its peak at the time. The case was high profile and interesting, so the show's management readily responded to the call. A team of parapsychologists arrived in Chisinau, among whom were the finalist of the 6th season of Battle of the Psychics, Ziradin Rzaev, and the winner of the same season, Alexander Litvin. Together with the relatives of the victims, the psychics drove around the city, visited the places where the young man and woman spent time, and looked at the crime scene. They only missed the Hyperion Lyceum, where Olga and Ilya studied. Parents, relatives, and friends, holding their breath, were waiting for the recognized possessors of supernatural abilities to provide at least some information about the criminal, at least some kind of clue. But the psychics didn't offer anything concrete. After retelling all the known facts about the victims, Ziradin Rzaev stated that he saw an abandoned house where the suspect might be hiding, and that this house could be identified by a bunch of garlic that the criminal had hung over the door. The maniac remains in Dorleshti, Rzaev stated with confidence.
And now he is somewhere in the city. He is here. City.
Lovers remind him of his own unhappy love, and by dealing with them, he tries to drown out his depression.
I pity him because he endures immense suffering. Killing temporarily eases his pain before the agony returns, driving him to kill once more.
According to the psychic, the maniac was a man between 35 and 45 years old, grey-haired, of large build, and very self-confident. He also indicated that the criminal has scars on his face, that is, he confirmed what the investigation and Ekaterina, who survived the attack, had said earlier. Alexander Litvin partially confirmed the conclusions of his colleague and promised the relatives of Molly and Ilya that the criminal would be caught very soon.
The arrest will definitely happen, I have no doubt about it at all, and it will be the police officers who arrest him. He will slip up on some small detail.
Both psychics warned that before he is caught, he will have time to add at least one more couple in love to his list. Of course, it was impossible to build an investigation on the words of psychics, but they did stir up public excitement. The residents of the capital began to demand results from law enforcement with renewed vigor. The discontent with the investigative authorities' inaction and helplessness grew increasingly vocal. The prosecutor's office and Ministry of Internal Affairs worked with increased effort to provide people with some form of response. One after another, psychological examinations were conducted. Meetings were held with law enforcement agencies of the Commonwealth of Independent States. The psychological profile of the criminal was re-examined, but the investigation was hampered by the fact that it was impossible to determine the motives of the maniac. Several versions were worked out at once, but many of them were dismissed at the initial stage, and there was not enough evidence for the others. The investigation formed a final image of the maniac based on the results of the examinations, consultations, and the testimonies of Igor Kazaku and his girlfriend Ekaterina. A man between 30 and 40 years old, a former military man or someone with a criminal past, skilled in handling smoothbore weapons, physically strong, and suffering from a mental disorder. Now it was necessary to find a suitable suspect. Throughout the entire investigation, several hundred suspects were processed, but there are a few names that came up especially often. The first such suspect was 39-year-old Georgi Inkolits, whom the police began searching for immediately after the deaths of Ilya and Olga Inkolits. He lived in Dorlești, had a medical education, and once worked as a doctor. In the year 2000, he took the lives of his sister and her 2-year-old child and threw their bodies into a well, after which he was declared insane and sent for compulsory treatment in a closed psychiatric institution. He stayed there for about 8 years, and in 2007 he escaped from the hospital and disappeared. Since he had a previous conviction for a similar case and matched other criteria, his name was repeatedly mentioned by the investigation. Georgi Inkolits was wanted until 2012, when it became known that he had died. The man had passed away in 2007. At that time, a body was found near the Republican Psychiatric Hospital which could not be identified, and so it was buried in the local cemetery. That body turned out to be Inkolits. Consequently, the man could not have been the Dorlești maniac. The other known suspects were the brothers Vladimir and Yevgeny Fedoruk. Both were brought in on the case of Valery Kroitor and Mariana Jembei without a preliminary interrogation. A preventive measure in the form of detention was chosen for them. One of the brothers was in Turkey at that time, where he waited for a whole year for extradition to Moldova. The second brother, who was mentally ill, was placed in a psychiatric hospital. The investigation later insisted that they had grounds to detain the brothers. But in any case, at the beginning of 2013, both Fedoriuk brothers were released due to lack of evidence of guilt. The most well-known and high-profile episode in the investigation was the trial of Andrei Crăciun, although at first no one connected him with the Dorlești maniac. In July 2007, Ștefan Cerescu and Rozan Janiv were walking around their vineyards. When gunshots suddenly rang out, Cerescu was wounded in the throat and soon died from his injuries, while Janiv was shot in the chest but survived. A resident of Chisinau living nearby, Andrei Crăciun, was arrested as a suspect. The investigation aimed to solve the case while leads were fresh, and psychological and physical pressure was applied, which Andrei could not withstand. Under pressure, and as it was later revealed torture, he wrote a confession and ended up in the defendant's seat. The trial court reviewed the case in the first instance, and Crăciun was sentenced to 21 years of imprisonment. When, in 2011, investigators began to review cases of crimes similar to those committed by the Dorlești maniac, it became clear that the attack on Cerescu and Janiev was also his doing. It had the same signature and method of execution. This meant that there was an innocent person in prison. In 2013, 5 years and 8 months after Andrei Crăciun ended up behind bars, the Chisinau Court of Appeals overturned the guilty verdict and, under the pressure of irrefutable evidence of innocence, released the man. Justice was restored, but at a high price. For almost 6 years, the man spent behind bars, serving a sentence for a crime he did not commit. The proceedings in this case were later combined with the proceedings for all similar episodes from 2009 to 2011. Now, the attack on Cerescu and Janiev is considered the first appearance of the Dolezhti Maniac. At the same time as Crăciun's release, a criminal case was initiated against the prosecutor who handled the case and the police officer who forged the documents that led to Andrei's unlawful conviction. In 2017, the case was brought to court and prosecutor Lilian Cociu was convicted for bringing a knowingly innocent person to criminal responsibility. Police officer Gennady Ababi was found guilty of forging documents in the criminal investigation case. The main basis for the charges was largely the testimony of Andrei Krishin. In 2019, lawyer Liliana Cociu appealed the verdict in the Chisinau Appellate Court. After reviewing the appeal, the panel of judges found the prosecution's evidence of Cociu's guilt to be insufficient. Crăciun's testimony was described as contradictory and vague. On December 11, 2019, the police prosecutors were acquitted and Cociu soon returned to his position at the Chisinau City Prosecutor's Office. No one from the higher leadership was held accountable for the wrongful conviction of Andrei Crăciun. So, an innocent man was convicted and spent almost 6 years in prison, while the real criminal is still at large. By that time, the criminal case about the Dolezhti Maniac already had more than 40 volumes, each with 365 pages. Hundreds of suspects, hundreds of searches, several dozen other crimes solved along the way, and still the elusive criminal who could strike again at any moment. However, by the time Crăciun was released, the maniac from Dolezhti had already been inactive for the 2nd year. The anxiety of the local residents began to subside, there was hope that it was all over, and even the human tragedies started to fade from memory. The public remembered the Maniac case again. Already in 2014, after a publication appeared in the media with statements from the former prosecutor of Chisinau General, according to the Soviet ranking system, State Councilor of Justice Ivan Diakov. At that time, Diakov was the only lawyer in Moldova since 1984 who had undergone special training in solving murders committed under unclear circumstances. Based on his knowledge and experience, he asserted that the murders had either stopped because the criminal had died or because he was serving time in prison for another crime that was not associated with the Dolezhti events. At the time, Diakov was seen as a disgraced prosecutor due to conflicts with leadership. He publicly accused the prosecutor's office and investigators of stalling the investigation. In Diakov's opinion, many of the arrests and searches in the case were carried out in violation of the law and solely for personal reasons, to silence political opponents or to ruin someone's unwanted business. Moreover, the former prosecutor was even ready to name the criminal, the real Dolezhti Maniac. According to him, Alexander Miron, a major who worked at the Academy of the Armed Forces, was responsible. In August 2011, that is a month after the last attack by the Dolezhti Maniac, Miron shot his wife with a hunting rifle and was sentenced to 23 years in prison. He is currently serving his sentence. By the way, the rifle was never found. Alexander Miron lived in Dolezhti and had a Japanese motorcycle which allowed him to quickly appear and disappear from the scene of the crime. The possible presence of a motorcycle with the criminal was indicated by Igor Kazaku, who survived the attack. Another thing that supported this version was that the attack stopped at the same time as Miron's arrest. However, as Diakov himself noted, his version was purely a personal opinion, not based on the case materials. Nevertheless, the investigation looked into this version and found it unviable. Miron successfully passed the lie detector test and his fingerprints were not found at the crime scene. He was never officially considered a suspect in the Dolezhti Maniac case. One of the last mentions of the Dolezhti Maniac case in the media is also connected with the name Ivan Diakov. Already in 2019, speaking on one of the Moldovan television channels, the former prosecutor stated that the criminal had already been in prison for 8 years. Discussing this is not beneficial for the investigation due to the numerous falsifications and manipulations in the Maniac case. According to Diakov, he asked the parents of Oli Kishlar and Ilya Raku to request the case file from the prosecutor's office, and he intends to personally see the investigation through to the end. More than 10 years have passed since those events. The case of the Durlești maniac is under the jurisdiction of the Prosecutor's Office for Combating Organized Crime and Special Cases. And to this day, reports are occasionally written about it, and the circle of people who might be involved in those now distant and half-forgotten events is updated. Forgotten predictions of psychics who confidently promised the imminent capture of the criminal. At present, the investigation has no official suspects or defendants in the case. The memorial page for Ilya and Olga on social media has been abandoned since 2014, but the internet has preserved their last photo together. According to rumors, the parents of the deceased teenagers have repeatedly asked to close the criminal case, but the law does not allow for such an option, and the investigators themselves are not planning to give up. The investigation is ongoing.